Well, good morning, Merry Christmas, and welcome back to the shop. So now, as you can see, the front fenders are back on the car. Now, I put these fenders on because, as you know, I'm working on trying to get the fitment right and putting the inner mud guards and all of the things that need to have first, and then I was going to cut and polish. But as soon as I put the front fenders on, it reminded me of a problem that I knew I was going to have, but I had chosen to ignore. And that is, we have a 1-inch lowering kit on the back of this car. And although we did the Shelby drop, the front end, the gaps, unfortunately, are much greater than they are in the rear. Let's take a look. So as we know, we put a lowering kit on the back of the car. So the back is 1 inch lowered. So if you take a look, you can see that the wheel is fitting into the wheel well, and there's a bit of a gap at the top, and it's fairly close, but again, it's a 1 inch drop. Now, if we take a look at the front, you'll see that the gap is more substantial. It is actually a lot more. And in fact, here's my problem. If we walk around the front of the car, and we look now at the passenger side, it may be tough to tell, but that's actually larger. So the gap is larger on the passenger side. It is smaller on the driver's side. And although you can't tell on the rear because it is so close, there's actually a 1/4 inch difference between the left rear and the right rear. So now, how do we solve that? So the first step was to find out exactly where the gaps were. So I went around, I put a flat bar on top of the tire, I put a level on the flat bar to make sure that the flat bar was of course level, and then I measured from that flat bar to the fender, and that gave me my gaps. Now, 2 things came out of those measurements. Number 1, of course, the front is higher than the back because we put a lowering kit on, but basically it's almost 1 inch taller in the front, even after doing the Shelby drop. Now, it's possible that it would have even been worse before the Shelby drop, but it's done is done. Regardless, we want to get this car level. So first off, we need to drop the front. Second thing though, unfortunately, we discovered there's an imbalance. There's actually a 1/4 inch difference between the gap in the driver's side and the gap on the passenger side. And the reason we have that could be because there's a spring problem, and one of those things could be that when I put this car back together, did I set that spring into its perch? Is that coil sitting directly against the end stop of the perch? Because if it's not, it will then be holding that spring a little bit further away, which means it'll be putting a little bit more pressure on the upper control arm, which means it'll be pushing the tire further away from the car and therefore getting a larger gap. Now, a larger gap means this front is pushing hard down on the ground, which means the back gets squished. And that's why I have a 1 1/8 inch gap in the driver's rear, but I have a 1 1/4 inch gap on the passenger rear, because the front is pushed up. It's now teetering on these 2 wheels and it's pushing this one down. And the same thing's happening over here. Because this tire is further up into the wheel well, it's exerting less pressure on the front, which means this rear spring can actually relax a bit and push up, giving me the bigger gap. So I've got an imbalance in the front. So as I said, I'm going to first check to see if the perches are right, make sure the springs are sitting correctly. If they are, then I have to adjust the springs individually to balance the back out. So we need to cut the springs. Now, we knew we were going to need to cut the springs anyways because we need to drop this car in order to match the rear. And that was going to be about 1 inch, right? Because we put a 1 inch lowering kit in the rear end. Therefore, with that 1 inch lowering in the rear end, I was going to then lower the front 1 inch as well. The reason there's a slight difference, and again, it's only 7/8, so it's only 1/8 of an inch, is possibly the Shelby drop, which dropped that front end a little bit. But basically, I still need to pull 1 inch out of the front end. So now, if you want to pull 1 inch out of your ride height, do not take 1 inch out of your coil springs. And I'm going to show you why. So let's turn our attention over here. So basically, this is an upper control arm for my 1968 Mustang. It is 9 1/2 inches from the pivot point, which bolts to the body, to the ball joint where the spindle mounts on, and that's where my tire is on that spindle, right? That tire height is positioned by the spring putting pressure down onto the spring perch, which is about halfway between the pivot point on the car and the ball joint. So let's just say we want to pull an inch out of the car. Now, if we want to pull an inch out of the car and you think to yourself, well, then just pull an inch out of the spring, what will happen is I've already marked 2 marks here. This is 1/2 inch and that's 1 inch. If I take 1 inch out of the spring, so let's go to the same pivot point, right? This is the pivot point here. And I take 1 inch out of the spring, which means this is going to move up 1 inch at this point. You can see that actually translates into 2 inches out of the ride height. So if you pull 1 inch from your spring, you will pull 2 inches out of your ride height. So when you are thinking of cutting your springs, you have to really understand how much you want to drop your height. So on my side then, we have 2 in the front. So I could simply say, well, we literally could drop the front 1 inch in order to get it down to, it would then become 1 inch. Now the back would be 1 1/8, but we're actually going to fix that because remember the car is cantering as well because we have an imbalance. So let's adjust this. So let's just say we're going to pull 1/2 inch out of the driver's front spring. Now, if we pull 1/2 inch out of that spring, we know we're going to drop that 1 inch. So now instead of having a 2 inch gap here, we're going to have a 1 inch gap on the driver's front. Now, on the passenger front, if we would pull also 1/2 inch, that would drop the front to then 2 1/4. So now the front would become 2 1/4. But we would still have our imbalance. So we actually want to drop this one a little bit more. So actually, instead of dropping it 1/2 inch, I'm going to drop it 5/8 inch. So now dropping it 5/8 inch will mean I'm going to actually take 1 1/4 inch out of the ride height. Our quarter that we're trying to get rid of will knock that quarter out. So we're going to pull 1/2 inch out of the driver's front. We're going to pull 5/8 out of the passenger front. And hopefully then that'll balance the front end. That'll then compensate for these 2 and bring them back in line. And that'll give me a consistent gap between the tire and the fender on the front left and on the front right. What I said before though, remember, 1/2 inch. So here's my 1/2 inch mark. If I do the same thing and go to the pivot point, but I only come up to the 1/2 inch point and draw my line, you can see now there's the original, there's the translation of the 1/2 inch of the spring, and if we take a measurement, 1 inch. The great news about taking this car apart so many times over the last couple of years is that pulling the springs out was a 30-minute job. Quite literally, leave the car on the ground, pull the shocks, right? Because you can just pull the towers out and then just remove the bolts on the bottom of the shocks and the shocks pull right out because the car is under suspension. So of course the shocks are not under any pressure whatsoever. Then I removed the spring shrouds, right? On the outer fenders, there are a couple of spring shrouds, 6 bolts. You remove those bolts, the shrouds come off. Once the shrouds are off, you insert your compressor. You can just do it hand tight because remember the car is under suspension, so the springs are collapsed. You put your compressor in hand tight, and then you jack the car up. And of course, then the A-arm swings away, and the spring loosens up, not enough to pull. And then all you got to do is a little bit more tightening on your spring compressor, and out pops the spring. So I now have 2 springs on my bench. I have the driver's side, and I have the passenger side. And there's been something a little telling. So first, the driver's side, if we measure the driver's side, and the way you do this is you put the tape right to the bottom, obviously, and you take it right to the top. And you can probably see, hopefully you can see, that is 16 3/8 inch to the top of the spring. But if we go to the passenger side, this is 16 1/2 inch. It is 1/8 inch taller. Now you say to yourself, that's nothing. Well, remember, everything is multiplied by 2. So 1/8 of an inch difference in the spring height is going to translate into a 1/4 of an inch distance in the ride height. And in my case, remember, my driver's side was 2-inch gap, my passenger side was 2 1/4 inch gap, and now we found out why. Why these springs are different lengths. Unfortunately, they're 50 years old. I'm just going to leave it to the fact that they aged. So now, what do? Well, originally we were going to cut these different lengths to compensate for that offset, but in fact, it turns out that it is caused by a longer spring. So really, I just need to shorten these springs by 1/2 an inch so that I get my 1-inch drop, which is what I wanted in the first place. So how do we get my 1/2 inch? Well, we know that the shorter spring is 16 3/8. So to remove a 1/2 an inch, we have to remove 4/8. And to remove 4/8, what we end up with then is 15 7/8, right? Because 15 7/8 plus 4/8 is 16 3/8. So easy math, right? So 16 3/8 becomes 15 7/8. Now, 15 7/8, how do we do that? Well, you take the spring and you rotate it to a lower spot, and then you take your measuring tape, just like you did before, and you go to 15 7/8. And 15 7/8 is right there, right on the spring, right here. So that's 15 7/8, right on this edge. So now, if I take my cutoff wheel and I cut straight through, I will have removed 1/2 of an inch from the height down to this point. So from this point down to this point. Now, I'm going to use the cutoff wheel because you don't want to apply any heat here, or as little heat as possible. I'm actually going to wrap some cold blankets around here, or some cold cloths. But no plasma cutters and no acetylene torches, because if you change the characteristics of the spring, then you're obviously going to throw the whole thing off. But cutoff wheel at 15 7/8, cut, done. Now, as far as the passenger side, well, I'm just going to cut this at 15 7/8 as well. I'm going to make them exactly the same height, because that's what they should have been in the first place. So I'll make them exactly the same height, and that way there, when they go back in the car, that should balance the whole thing out, and that should compensate for the rear end, because I'm taking an extra 1/8 of an inch out of this one, because remember, this one's an extra 1/8 of an inch tall. So they'll both be exactly the same height. I don't have to compensate for anything, because this was my troublemaker. This is why the car was 1/4 inch high on the passenger side. So we'll make them the same, and we'll get them back in the car. I'll see you in a few minutes. Well, the old adage, measure twice, cut once, has nothing on this, because I have measured 8 times, and it still looks wrong to me. It still looks like this top is lower than this top. And I know it is just an optical illusion, because I have measured both springs 15 7/8 to the top of the spring perch right there. And again, 15 7/8 to the top of the spring perch there. They look wrong, but they're both 15 7/8. So I thought to myself, well, what other way could I verify these things having the same length? And I thought, well, there's one way. What I did is I'll take this spring, let's scoot it on the side like this. Let's take our level, high point, where we're going to cut it. Oh, let's do this. High point, where we're going to cut it, level it out there, and it's level at 1/2 of an inch. So that is cutting 1/2 inch off of this one, and that's what we want. We want 1/2 inch off of this one. Now that one, same thing on this side. I take my level, I put it right on the high point, I take my measuring, put it right on the black line, and I go to 1/2 inch, and you'll see the ball is not level, because remember, we're actually pulling 1 1/8. So let me go up to 1/8. There we go. That is 1/2 plus 1/8, so that's 5/8 of an inch. And now my bubble's level. So that is going to take 5/8 of an inch, which is the 1/2 inch plus the 1/8. And this side is going to take the 1/2 inch. So again, it's coming off 1/2 inch. It looks wrong. but you can only measure this so many ways to figure out it's right. So the only option left for me to do is to go and get my cutoff and cut these springs. Now remember, you're going to be cutting them with a cutoff wheel. You're not going to be using your plasma. You're not going to be using your acetylene. And the reason is you don't want to introduce heat because you'll change the characteristics of the spring. I'm going to cut straight up and down. I'm going to take my angle grinder and come straight down and cut straight so that we have exactly the same thing, just a straight line down the spring. So we're going to do that, but we're not going to do that today. It's already late in the afternoon. I'm done. I'm going to cut these tomorrow, so I guess it's going to be one of these to be continued. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the information I gave you today about lowering your car and how careful you have to be as far as how much spring you pull out. And a lot of that has to do with the length of your A-arm and where your spring is on that A-arm. Because basically, if the spring is about halfway down the A-arm, anything you pull out of the spring is going to double by the time it gets to the ball joint, and you're going to drop this car way too much. So again, I would rather cut too little than too much, or you're buying new springs. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit that like button, and I am going to call it a day. Tomorrow I'll come back and we're going to cut these springs, put them back in the car, and we're going to check some ride heights and see where we're at. I'll see you then.